Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this, it's the Film Reelists Podcast, hosted by Kyle Naranya, and on this week's episode, a review of Jason Reitman's Saturday Night. Welcome to episode 111, where I will be reviewing Jason Reitman's film Saturday Night, which was about the lead-up to the very first Saturday Night, then called Saturday Night, but Saturday Night Live episode. As usual, there will be a non-spoiler section of the review as well as a spoiler section of the review. Time codes will be listed in the description if you want to jump around. And to end the show, I will be responding to listeners' question of the week responses. Let's get into Saturday Night.
And now, weekend update.
Good evening. Gentlemen, how long have you been standing there?
Long enough.
One of the things I love most about this film is that it came out on October 11th, the 49th anniversary of the first ever episode of Saturday Night, now of course called Saturday Night Live. What's really interesting with this film's release is in an era where the film had no cultural relevance, of course, it hadn't premiered yet, but the hold and cultural impact that Saturday Night Live has dwindled over time. It's a really interesting reflection, especially going into next year's season, which will of course be the 50th, and the lead up to the 40th being so exciting, but outside of the political commentary, how rarely skits or sketches from this show seem as relevant. The most recent one that I can possibly think of is the Ryan Reynolds Beavis and Butthead episode, which I believe was a part of the Fall Guy premiere, press tour, which I thought was really, really funny. But outside of that, what did I think of Saturday Night? I like Jason Reitman. More than anything, what this film would struggle to do would to make a compelling drama, obviously full of substantial amounts of tension and leading into what couldn't have been known to be so significant at the time, but a springboard for so many popular comedians, and as I said, for such a long time being a culturally relevant and significant launching pad for so many comedians. And this film manages to do all those things. It premiered at TIFF, and my expectations were quite high. What I like most about all of the cast for this film is at no point do any of these performances feel like impressions. It does feel as if you were catching all of these people in this specific window leading up to the first ever episode. The film starts, and this is in the trailer, so this is not a spoiler, but it's 10 p.m., an hour and a half before the first ever show went live. And all of the anxiety, troubles, hurdles that Lorne Michaels, as well as the cast and crew leading up to this episode, that everybody had to overcome to get to the show, not knowing what the show would be, how would it be successful, how would it be received, a bunch of unproven talent at the time, and so many things that laid the groundwork and the framework for so many segments of comedy that we're just sort of used to now. It is especially interesting to get this time capsule that Jason Reitman has created for this. Overall, I really enjoyed this film a lot. I was concerned, as I said, that it would be a substantially anxiety-filled event, but from a pacing standpoint, the script that Reitman and Gil Keenan put together really does capture this window in time, which could have been almost farcical, or so many things are happening, how unrealistic this is. And I'm obviously, for the sake of drama and dramatization, things have been changed, but the legacy of this show and all of the Easter eggs put through, all of the different people that were involved with getting the show off the ground, it's a really compelling story more than anything. Whether that be, and it's interesting given the dynamic of mass media now, but Lorne Michaels, again, an unproven showrunner, writer, creator, working with his estranged wife and that whole bag of worms that entailed, and you can look all of this stuff up, but specifically having to go against established expectations of what would make it to air and the boundaries that would have been pushed at the time. It being 1975, almost 50 years ago, and what standards and practices would accept at the time, what they wouldn't, specific commentary or phrasing of crude things, trying to get that around the censors, and what does that mean? I found myself thoroughly enjoying the show, particularly with a lot of the Easter eggs that are laid out throughout the entire film, possibly references to skits that eventually made it to the air that were substantially well received and arguably some of the best of all time, and I don't want to ruin any of those teases. The cast, more than anything, is what's going to sell with this. Obviously, so many of these people are well-established, well-known now, but portraying all of these characters, not characters, but these youth in their early years could be really difficult because we know who all of them became. Capturing this unproven aspect of all of these comedians at the time could be really difficult. And I said that they weren't impressions, and they're not. However, the modern sensibility to which we are able to present these people, it's a more three-dimensional perspective as opposed to just comedians. Oh, they were funny. Let's not establish what was really going on at the time. And this is 1975. It is difficult to expect what was going on behind the scenes to be up to the standards and practices of how television shows are made now. But even more recently, we've seen with showrunners that the environment leading up to these projects is not necessarily a welcoming or inclusive or respectful environment. And to see the lunacy behind the scenes, whether that be crew members not wanting to work because they don't believe in the project, or people being harassed in some way or another, things being shown that should not necessarily be shown, and the dynamic with all those relationships builds into this really chaotic yet focused film, and not in a way where it feels disorganized like the film I reviewed last week, but the momentum that builds throughout this film is really gratifying, particularly because, of course, we do know that Saturday Night, or now called Saturday Night Live, did make it to air on October 11th, 1975. But I really enjoyed seeing the unknown with some of these sketches. One being a great example of the Weekend Update. It being a staple of the show for its entire run. And the thought process that went into those segments, people who were involved with the initial episode of this, and icons of comedy, George Carlin, Jim Henson's involvement, which is really interesting if you've watched the Jim Henson documentary that was released on Disney Plus. It does reference this event as well. And I've got to give Nicholas Braun, a lot of credit, because not only do I really enjoy his portrayal of Jim Henson, somebody who wanted Muppets/puppets to be treated with respect, and that they weren't necessary just for children's entertainment, but be used in multiple facets over different and wide variety of ages for entertainment, and his clashes with the significantly cruder perspective from the SNL writers at the time. And you'll hear a clip leading up to it, what happened with some of the writers and something that they did do with Big Bird. And as I've stated, with each of these cast members, allowing us an opportunity to get inside their heads and their perspective on what was going on, not sugarcoating some of the dynamics that were established with the cast. You can go back and look to see who had a good relationship, who didn't necessarily. And because of what we know now, it probably allows for a more three-dimensional perspective, whether that be the dynamic that Chevy Chase has historically now had with a substantial amount of his cast members, but also allowing the humanity to be in there, not just painting everybody as not a great person, but there was fear and trepidation leading into this event. Each of these people, for the most part, outside of who's the cast member, Garrett Morris, were complete unknowns, unestablished actors and comedians, some with more training than the others, and some not necessarily knowing what their roles would be more than the others, whether that was just to be there, or to actually bring something and help create the identity of what this show became. And each of the cast does a really great job with that performance. I stated Nicholas Braun, who also plays Jim Henson as well as Andy Kaufman. And for his limited screen time as Andy Kaufman, he does a good job, particularly in capturing the voices of those two actors, which is quite difficult. And one that I was quite impressed by, which was Nicholas Padoni as Briley Crystal. Most of these cast members have significantly iconic voices. And whether that's in the physical performances, which can sometimes be when creating somebody who we know in real life could become more of a caricature, they capture the tone and cadence of these people's voices without, again, falling into impressionism, which is a really fine line to walk, and I believe that everybody does that really well. Dylan O'Brien quite impressed me as Dan Aykroyd, specifically capturing who Dan is behind the scenes. That person who's so well informed will also tends to also have tinfoil hat perspectives as well. And Gabriel LaBelle, coming off of The Fabelmans, playing Lorne Michaels, who everybody would be familiar with Lorne Michaels' sound from Mike Myers' impression in Dr. Evil, or as Dr. Evil. That's what Mike Myers believes Lorne sounds like. And the confidence that would be required of somebody to have all this fear and anxiety, but still have confidence in what they have inside their head, knowing they are pushing against the establishment and showing something that people didn't know they wanted. Whether that's ego, confidence, unsubstantiated beliefs, he did it. And having somebody you follow through not be unlikable could be really difficult, but Gabriel's performance as Lorne really feels true to what Lorne probably felt at the time, and the obstacles and hurdles that he had to go through, whether that was no confidence from anybody at NBC or even the crew members who were supposed to be working for him, and all of the decisions that probably had to be made in the spur of the moment that eventually got the very first episode to air, is substantial. And the chaotic nature to which these relationships are presented is probably stretched to be a more dynamic film and a more interesting film. Regardless, nothing ever feels forced or extravagant or insane just for the sake of difficulty to make it feel more dynamic. Each of the obstacles presented in the film add more and more problems, and the way that we see everybody go around them or ignore them to begin with makes for a funny and entertaining film. I guess that's pretty much all I have to say in non-spoilers, so let's hop into spoilers and I can talk more about some of the specific plot details that I find quite interesting.
The writers tied a belt around Big Bird's neck and hung him from my dressing room door.
Hey, I heard about Big Bird. So sorry. Autoerotic asphyxiation, who knew?
We are now in full spoilers for Saturday Night, and you can find out... What happened? The film, of course, is on October 11th, 1975, and we are outside of the NBC building in New York City. An element to this film that I didn't discuss in non-spoilers is the amazing production design. They've recreated the entire 8th floor, or not 8th floor. I think it's 8th floor. This is probably something I should know, but I don't. Whatever floor Saturday Night Live is on, they have recreated that entire floor through extensive archived photos, interactions with everybody, interviews, set interviews, cast interviews, and everything to fully build this environment. And a level of immersion you get is particularly from the use of camera work. We are following Lorne Michaels around with essentially just an over-the-shoulder shot, not where we are seeing him from that perspective, but the handheld camera approach provides an opportunity, at least as I found this as an audience member, to feel as if I'm getting that behind the scenes look, to get a peek behind the curtain, an aspect to allow this to really feel as if we are there as it is happening. And where the set design comes down to, it really does help establish what time frame we're in. It would be difficult with a set designed poorly or production design not done effectively to put us in 1975. If it felt like a generic TV set studio, that level of immersion would be substantially harder to achieve. And because of that, we are able to follow the characters throughout the entire environment. And because of the anxiousness leading up to the event, I found the sets and the corridors between the writers' offices or whether that be the control room and the green rooms or the cast environment. What is that word? Oh my goodness. Not their trailer, their dressing rooms. That's the word I'm looking for. Felt substantially more claustrophobic as the film went on, whether that be because the film chooses to use a much more tight lens and we are getting less of a wide immersion or a wide look at all of the sets around us. That was something that I really did appreciate. As I stated in non-spoilers, the film starts off at 10 p.m., the hour and a half leading up, and more obstacles are getting in the way of whether that be a dress rehearsal or just trying to figure out exactly what the framework for the show was going to be. There were so many unused sketches for the first episode. We established that it was a 3-hour dress rehearsal that was not taped, which is another problem because Lauren's boss wants to just air the dress rehearsal and they'll go to live next week. And of course, the dress rehearsal was not filmed, so they have to go live. But the obstacle, the main one throughout the entire film, is everybody at NBC wanting to just air a pre-taped Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, and the relationship that he has with the whole idea of something else taking up Saturday night is not one he approaches with humility or positivity, much more of a threatening response to something taking over the popularity of the network at the time, which, again, is not something I'm used to hearing about Johnny Carson. Probably that might come from the fact that I just haven't looked into it as heavily, but regardless, I like that we get to see an aspect of these characters that might not be one you are used to. It's a much more informed perspective as to what the character's on. And an introduction of somebody like Milton Berle, who is played by J.K. Simmons, who has a substantial rumor about something about him, which is kind of irrelevant for my review. But after that, we get to see the dynamic of the old crew coming to terms with what it means for this new show with a bunch of nobodies to be taking up a prime spot like Saturday night. And the dynamics with a lot of these established players in television, studio execs, it's a really gross expectation they have for what their status means with how they can treat people. And it is one of the hardest aspects to watch in this film, the gross dynamics, whether that be indecent exposure or just full-on harassment that is happening. But this is not an excuse, but the behavior in a 1975 stage are obviously not things that would be, they're not even in the realm of possibility in 2024. And I mentioned this in the non-spoilers. I've said that way too much, but apologies. The dynamic between the main cast and the expectations for what this was going to mean for their careers. It's cool to see an inside perspective because behind the scenes information on this particular era are not as well documented in the fictional realm as, say, other comedy legends, particularly the relationship between Chevy Chase and John Belushi. Of course, John Belushi tragically passed away way too soon, but the distinction with how each and every one of the cast members approached comedy as an art form is a perspective I really appreciated, whether that be the quiet genius of John Belushi or obviously the extroverted, I would argue, narcissism of Chevy Chase and the dynamic of his expectation for the springboard that this was going to be, and the obstacles that he comes into, whether that be being put arguably back in his place when he bumps into Milton Berle, J.K. Simmons' character, the Mr. TV, who he's known as. And I found that especially funny because as somebody who watches way too much TV, I'd never heard of him. And the impact on what that has generationally is a really interesting statement. Whether that be specific or not, or on purpose, I don't know, but including somebody that was regarded to be Mr. TV, and for him to be, in my opinion, completely forgotten to several generations, it's a really interesting statement on where the art form particularly has gone after streaming. Again, that's not on purpose, but just as a reflection on the film afterwards, I found that to be quite cool and interesting. And back to, I guess, Lorne Michaels' character throughout this film, that every time a new obstacle comes into his path, he is attempting to find the solution, but then also cannot because there is another problem. Whether that be the standards and practices lady, or sets being incomplete, failing to choose what the show would be, what sketches were going to make it to the air, the infighting amongst the crew, his interesting relationship he has with his wife at the time, who also had an interesting relationship with Dan Aykroyd, as well as George Carlin not having any real faith in the show. And his performance was one I was completely blown away by, which was Matthew Rhys played George Carlin, and he was completely unrecognizable. It does help adding a wig and a beard to Matthew Rhys because that's not something he looks like normally. But this complete lack of faith in the show prior to its release, it's just the perspective on Saturday Night Live is really funny. And I talked about this earlier, how the expectation of this art form, particularly with this show, not knowing what it was going to be, what it has become, and I would, as I said, I think it's kind of forgettable now at this standpoint. It makes for a perfect bottle of primer leading into the foundational art form it was, or institution of comedy for so long, leading to what will be its 50th episode next year. And the journey you go on with Lorne being the focus, he's the main character of this. It's a journey of a really interesting perspective on the creative art form and the confidence he had in the vision he failed to be able to explain until quite literally down to the wire, where they weren't sure what the show was going to be and finally pitching what was going to work about it, literally hiring somebody from a bar during the night of the very airing of the very first episode. I really enjoyed this movie. It's hard to explain the feelings I had from it, I think, but it is a movie about an institution and manages to be funny yet dramatic, but captivating all at the same time. And for a smaller movie with a budget around $30 million to be successfully doing that, I really commend everybody involved. This is something I liked seeing on the big screen. Is it something necessary for that? I would say probably not, but it is definitely a film you should be watching. Now that will do it for Saturday Night Spoiler Review. Now let's jump into Question of the Week responses.
Can I ask you a question?
Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Last week's question of the week was, who is your favorite Joker, based off of my review of Joker Folie à Deux. Debbie wrote in Heath Ledger. Stephanie says, I'm probably one of the many who will say Heath Ledger. If I can forget who the actor is and not see them as their other roles, then I think they are doing an amazing job. Not once during Heath's performance as Joker did I see Patrick Verona or William Thatcher, and he definitely was not recognizable as himself. He was chaos as the Joker. Haley wrote in Mark Hamill. Scotty Cameron, my favorite Joker across all mediums is Mark Hamill. He exemplifies the character so well, and was just perfect foil to the one true Batman, Kevin Conroy. If I had to pick a favorite live-action Joker, it's Heath Ledger. Like Hamill, Joker was a great foil to Christian Bale's Batman. Email, here we go. Greetings, Kyle. You have burdened us with the impossible task this week by asking us to identify our favorite Joker. As a fellow DCAU connoisseur, the obvious choice for me is Mark Hamill. However, I want to also recognize a couple of honorable mentions. Number 1, Kevin Michael Richardson was a superb Joker in The Batman, the animated series. It had elements of Mark Hamill-esque homage, but it is still uniquely his own with a rich, deep voice, and it's vastly underrated, as well as that series as a whole, to be honest. Number 2, John DiMaggio as Joker in Batman Under the Red Hood was a different approach, but it worked really well in that film. Very menacing while also aloof. I had to believe this version is part of the inspiration for Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal on screen, and if only for the scene of killing a television host live on TV. Okay. Also, as I type this, I realize all of my selections have been voice actors with no selection of a live action portrayal, and I think I'm going to leave it that way. I'll end my answer with a question in return. Which version of Harley Quinn is your favorite, excluding Arlene Sorkin? Keep it keen, Keen Machine. Oh, Keen, that's a really great question. While I think the obvious answer would be Tara Strong, who took over after Arlene Sorkin, there have been less versions of her than you would think. There is, of course, the Kaylee Cuoco Harley Quinn in Harley Quinn the Show, which I haven't watched enough of it to really have an opinion. It is on my it's on my watch list of shows I haven't watched yet. There is, now I want to get her name right, in Harley Quinn and the Batman. There are so few versions of that version of Harley Quinn from the DCAU to be portrayed by other people. Melissa Rauch, that version is fun. I would have to say, I think it's probably the most present in my mind right now, but I believe it's Jamie Chung in Caped Crusaders. I really liked her portrayal, but in terms of capturing the character in live action, which has only been done once so far, I love Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn. I feel that she covers all the facets of that character and has portrayed her in many different circumstances, and the dynamic she has in a lot of different relationships really does feel like she understands the core of that character. So probably simplest in live action with Margot Robbie, but Jamie Chung's portrayal in Batman Caped Crusader is something I really appreciated, and as I stated in my review, I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do with her moving forward. So thanks so much for that question, Keen. And again, this has been stated more recently. If you don't have an answer for the question, please just ask me one, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. David wrote in Heath Ledger, and then Dylan Pollock of Movies to Watch Before You Die writes in, I think you'll know my favorite Joker is absolutely Mark Hamill. Beyond that, I'd have on the next tier Jack Nicholson. John DiMaggio is a great Under the Red Hood Joker, and Kevin Michael Richardson is great in The Batman. Joaquin Phoenix is obviously very good, but I don't find it Batman associated enough to really think of it when asked the question. Alan Tudyk's Joker from Harley Quinn saying, "Where's my damn electric car, Bruce?" lives rent-free in my head. That is a fun Joker, and Alan Tudyk in general is absolutely amazing, so it's not really shocking that Alan Tudyk is a great version of the Joker, but he's probably an underutilized Joker in other Batman media. Thank you so much to everybody who submitted their answers to the question of the week. Now, this week's question of the week is a broad one, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what people have to say, which is, what is your favorite Saturday Night Live sketch? It could be digital only or one they performed live. I'm really hoping to see a wide variety of choices for this, and I think it's going to be generationally specific because depending on the era you grew up with, that's probably going to affect your answer. To submit your answer, you can email the podcast, filmreelistpod@gmail.com. You can comment on any of the social media stuff, just with hashtag question of the week, or you can answer directly on a comment on YouTube. The podcast is there as well. Next week's episode is a little up in the air, but I can confirm one part of it at least will be a review of Tomb Raider, the animated series that debuted on Netflix on October 10th. So you can look forward to that. And for any other announcements as to what is going to be going on with the podcast, make sure you are following on whatever your favorite social media platform is. I'm trying to make a push with the show on Spotify specifically. If you did enjoy this, please drop a follow or a 5-star review. It helps the show grow, which would be amazing. I'm hoping 2024 to be the biggest year of the podcast yet, going into 2025. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I hope to see you next time.